Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm Carla with Race to Walk, and I am here with Dr. Michael Ward, and he is a senior research fellow at Blackfriars Hall at the University of Oxford, and he's also a professor of apologetics at Houston Baptist University, and he is a Catholic priest. You may know him from his book Planet Narnia or some of his other Lewis scholarship, or you may recognize him from his appearance in the James Bond movie, The World Is Never Enough. But today we're going to be talking about his latest book, which is After Humanity, and it's a guide to C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man. So, Dr. Ward, would you like to tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Hello, Carla. Thank you for having me. Yes, what else do you want to know? I'm speaking to you from Oxford in England. I'm not in Houston at the moment. I only come to Houston once a year for a week, usually in March. And the teaching I do for Houston Baptist is online. I teach a course in the spring and a course in the fall, focusing on C.S. Lewis and Tolkien. And that's how we met, isn't it? Through Houston Baptist.
Yeah. I took CS. Which one did I take? I took your second one. It's literature and apologetics, and that was a really fun class. We read The Lord of the Rings and C.S. Lewis's Cosmic Trilogy, and we were just talking about kind of locations before we came on. And I actually was doing my pre-reading for The Lord of the Rings when Harvey hit, and I was totally out of power. So anyway, memories. So anyway, you've written this book about the abolition of man, and the abolition of man is a book that we read in a class on research and writing, and Lewis wrote this in the middle of World War II about problems that he saw, and there's different people who have booktube channels. There's been a lot of discussion about the abolition of man recently, actually, because people have been doing read-throughs of Lewis's work, and this book really kind of gives an insight, doesn't it, to everything he writes, his fiction, but it's a really, really hard read. I remember reading it and just almost being a little overwhelmed the first time I went through it.
Yeah, it's a difficult work, which is why it needs this guide. But it's an important work, which is why it needs this guide. Lewis himself regarded it as almost my favorite among my books, he said. And his editor and biographer, Walter Hooper, has described it as an all but indispensable introduction to the entire corpus of Lewisiana. Other people have described it as the linchpin of Lewis's work, which I think is not overstating it, really. I found myself, as I worked on this book, that I began to see why Lewis would have said it was almost his favorite among his books, because it does feed into so much of his thought. But because it's difficult, it's been largely overlooked. And that's why, I thought, after having, struggled with it myself for many years and having tried to teach it to students who I could see were struggling with it too, I thought it's time to write a guide to this book and hopefully bring some ease and clarity to the topic, because it's perfectly explicable once you give it a bit of close attention, but it just needs a bit of sustained thought and effort.
The other thing that I noted, because I went through it in the class, and most of the time in my classes in the apologetics program, there would be things that I didn't understand, but I knew, okay, well, if I go into the class, there'll be a lot of discussion about it, and usually that would explain it. Well, the class that we read Abolition of Man in, we only had two people. It's Katarina Scott and I. There were some other people that were scheduled, but they all washed out. And so I didn't really feel like we had the breadth of discussion that we normally would in the class. So I kind of felt like I didn't really get it. It wasn't as much as I normally would have. And so when we launched the journal and our first issue was on the abolition of man, I had to read it again. I had to read a lot of commentary and just just to make sure, because I knew what I wanted to write about, but I needed to make sure that what I was thinking it actually meant. And so I took a lot of research. But reading this book, I'm thinking, okay, maybe I didn't understand it as well as I thought I did, even though I had got over it a few times.
Yes, and we ought to make clear that this class was not one that I taught.
No,
Not
no.
aspersions on any other professor.
No,
of course, but it
yeah,
wasn't my role to explain it on that occasion. No, but yeah,
yeah.
it's a difficult book, and it's, I think, one of the reasons that Christians in particular find it difficult is that they come to this work expecting it to be a work of Christian apologetics, because they know that C.S. Lewis wrote Mere Christianity. They know that he wrote The Problem of Pain. They're probably familiar with Narnia and maybe the Screwtape Letters. And they turn eagerly to The Abolition of Man, especially as it's a nice thin book. And they think, oh, here's a nice short volume. I can get through this quickly and add another C.S. Lewis title to my list. And then they they find that although it's slim, it's very, very weighty. It's probably his densest work, pound for pound, I like to say. And that's partly because it originated as 3 philosophy lectures that he gave at the University of Durham. So he was operating in a high-level university context, lectures, so that he knew that if people who heard him immediately didn't understand anything, they could pepper him with questions afterwards. And also, I think even if it was relatively accessible in the 1940s, it's become less accessible now because a lot of the sort of educational norms that he could depend upon and rely upon people knowing the basic Latin and maybe Greek and some of the classics, you can't make that assumption anymore. Not in Britain, and I think particularly not in America, where of course the larger part of Lewis's audience now resides.
Well, the other thing too, so just as a little bit of an explanation of how the book is structured, Dr. Ward gives an introduction to it, kind of an overview, and then he literally goes through page by page and gives like notes and annotations to different references. So one of the things is just how like almost in the center of culture the Abolition of Man was written from. Like there's like these underlying comments about like fellow academics or different things going on at the time that you completely miss. So before you started writing the book, did you know about those things, or did you discover them as you were writing them?
No, I didn't know most of them at all. By the way, sorry for moving my screen about just then. I was picking out the copy of the book, The Abolition of Man. This is what we're talking about, of course. And you'll be pleased to see, I'm very delighted myself. It's got a matching cover to my guide. HarperCollins have released a new version of the book to tie in with my new volume. But no, I didn't know much about these things at all. Even being, something of a Lewis scholar myself, there's quite a lot that I didn't know, not least because I'm not a philosopher. I'm a literary critic and a theologian. I'm not philosophically trained. And to that extent, it's slightly outside my own comfort zone to investigate this book. But I hope that's all to the good, because it means that I don't come with any sort of assumptions about what people are going to find either hard or easy, because it's just all hard as far as I'm concerned. So I explain pretty much everything that I could conceive that people would find difficult, and I was able to include a 30-page photo gallery in the middle of the book. The publishers like to include pictures, and so I got photographs of of most of the people that Lewis refers to in the course of his argument, including some that he doesn't name under their own names. He gives them pseudonyms, but I unearthed who he was referring to. This book that he talks about, the Green Book, which is his target in the first lecture. That wasn't really called the Green Book. It was called The Control of Language. So I unearthed all things about that. And, it's these sorts of geological digging down through the strata. It's a kind of archaeological dig. It's for all that it's a short volume. It's a very complex and tightly packed piece of work.
This one was, it's only a very small book, and it's only 111 pages in this edition, and that includes the notes at the end. So the actual essay is 93 pages in this. I have a review on my YouTube channel of The Abolition of Man, and a lot of comments on, I tried reading this, I need to read it again. So that was one thing that people have mentioned when I put this up. Okay, I need to get this book, because you just you need the context. The other thing that I really liked about this book is that you give kind of a synopsis of Lewis's life. You said that if you want to understand somebody's writing, find out what was going on in the world when they were 20. Do you want to talk a little bit about how his experience impacted his thought?
Absolutely, because well, first of all, let's just nail what The Abolition of Man is really about. It's about whether value is objective or not. And Lewis is saying value is objective. So that's a large part of The Abolition of Man. And then the other part is really a kind of prediction about what will happen to us if we don't hold on to a belief in the objectivity of value. If we let that go, he says, we will be on a short road to self-destruction. And that's why he calls his book The Abolition of Man. We will be removing a central part of our own humanity if we don't cling to the objectivity of value. And that's why I call my own guide After Humanity. Or at least one of the reasons. So that's what the Abolition of Man is about. And then what does it have to do with his own background and when he himself was 20? Well, when he was 20, he was fighting in the First World War. C.S. Lewis was an officer in the British Army during the Great War, and he was very nearly killed. He was blown up by a shell that landed in his trench, and some of his closest friends were killed. And this is relevant to The Abolition of Man, because in The Abolition of Man, he argues that death for a good cause is the crucial test of the objectivity of value. Because if you're suffering or dying for your friends, for your nation, whatever it may be, or even just much more minor pains and inconveniences that you would have to undergo for the sake of holding to the truth or to the good or to the right, all these pains and sufferings and even deaths are the crucial test of the objectivity of value. Because if it was only subjective, if it was purely projection from your own will, then you could change it as soon as you began to suffer for it. And the fact that you don't change, the fact that you go through with these pains, shows that you really believe in the objectivity of this standard that you're holding to. So the fact that Lewis himself had lived through a war and had very nearly been killed by it during it, and seen many of his friends die during it, and yet still believed in the value of self-sacrifice, the objective value of self-sacrifice, helps to give a sort of autobiographical, a personal, existential kind of heft to his argument. He's not just, creaming off some abstract skim from the top of his thought. It's much deeper than that. He's tested this on his own pulses. And I think that's one of the reasons why The Abolition of Man has achieved such a status as a classic text.
Yeah, I had read, what's amazing to me is that just how appropriate it still is, even, what is this, 70, 80 years later? 43, almost 80 years. And it's still the same things. After I just came out of the class, read The Abolition of Man, there was this whole thing that happened in our school district, and I started researching what was going on in the players, and I was like, oh my goodness, this is a green book in The Abolition of Man. This is exactly what's going on. And I don't know that we've really learned so much since then. It's almost like we've learned nothing from what we've gone through.
Yeah, if anything, we've got even into a worse situation than the one that Lewis was addressing in the 1940s, and that was bad enough. You know, many of his predictions and his forecasts seem to be coming alarmingly true. So yeah, it has been described as a very prophetic, prescient work, and not just by Christians either. This is one of the interesting things. There's a contemporary British philosopher and atheist called John Gray, quite a prominent thinker in Britain at the moment, and he has spoken very highly of the abolition of man and says that it's as relevant now as it was when it first came out, if not more so. And he recently gave a whole BBC radio program all about the abolition of man, and he's an atheist. And that shows us that, you know, what Lewis is arguing here for is not anything specifically Christian or specifically even theistic, though of course it's entirely compatible and consistent with Christianity and theism. What he's arguing for is much more sort of basic philosophical definition of what it means to be human. Because of course you can only be a Christian human being if you're a human being first. So it's as if he's trying to say, let's work out what it means to be human, and take that as our starting point. And what it means to be human is to be aware of right and wrong, of good and evil. That this is just a fact about the universe, which we discover. We don't invent right and wrong. We discover them. We discover them like we discover the truths of mathematics, and they could not be otherwise. And if we try to make them otherwise, then we will be, you know, sort of diminishing our own human inheritance. We won't be able to transmit it to the next generation. Because although this thing is objective, it still needs to be taught and learned. And that's why moral education, moral formation is such an important part of the argument that he makes in the course of the book.
So you've been doing quite a few interviews on this book, but when I was reading through it, I was just trying to think of what are the things I really want to talk about, because there's so much you could talk about in this book. But one of the things that was really interesting to me was the section where you're talking about, this is like in the beginning, and you're talking about the dangers of the subjectivism. And so we're going to look at that a little bit. But what really stood out to me was that what Lewis is saying here about this warning against this ceasing to be human because we don't recognize the value outside of ourselves is really the same thing that Hosea is talking about in Hosea chapter 4. And I have a blog post on my website about the verse that my people perish for the lack of knowledge. People do a ton of searches about this, and it's the same thing. Hosea is talking about they're going to suffer, and they're not even going to know why, because they don't know me. They don't know my justice, my righteousness. And so they just completely unaware. Do you want to talk a little bit about those sections in that was you were page 15 and 16 and After Humanity?
Yeah, well, I mean, of course, before we get into that, it's important to emphasize that from an explicitly Christian point of view, if Lewis were making this argument with his Christian apologist's hat on, he would be saying very, very similar things. But he'd be pushing them to the next stage. He'd be saying, we have this awareness of right and wrong because, not just because we're human, but because we're humans who have been made in the image of a good God. And therefore this awareness that we have of good and evil is a reflection of God's image in us. And it's the conscience that the Creator has put inside every one of us, which is telling us right from wrong, good from evil. And this is what St. Paul talks about in the letter to the Romans, isn't it? About how, you know, even the Gentiles outside the law are a law unto themselves, and their conscience now acquitting them, now condemning them. But of course, it's possible to sear your conscience, to, you know, callous your own awareness of right and wrong, good and evil, so that as you know, we find in some of the Old Testament prophets like Hosea, you end up becoming absolutely blind to good and evil. You don't even know what you don't know. You can become so morally anesthetized or numb, or just senseless, insensible. However, and this is a point that Lewis makes in the course of The Abolition of Man, even those people who say that moral value is not objective find it very difficult to live according to that belief, because in practice we all have some sorts of values which we don't just want to discard. We certainly don't want other people to discard them when they impact upon us. It's like that old statement about honor among thieves. Thieves don't respect the property of other people, but within the little band of robbers, you bet they respect it, and they don't want fellow robbers to thieve from themselves. So Lewis will point out that it's very difficult to live in a radically and consistent subjectivist frame of mind. So these people that he attacks in the course of his argument, the writers of this green book, Gaius and Titius, he calls them, they imply, or they even assert, that moral value isn't anything real, and yet they do, in the course of their own book, propose any number of things which it seems that they hold to be objectively valuable. And Lewis lists them, and it turns out that they're not very exalted, but they are at least apparently held to be objective.
Yeah, that was, let's see, I think on, what was it? It was, I think one of the things that you highlight in here in the talking about the abolition of man is that we think of it as if somebody who makes those choices, we understand that their conscience may be seared, their character may be seared, but it's not just, doesn't just impact them, it also impacts their children and who they influence. So the impact is beyond themselves. And was it you that called them artifacts, or was that something?
Oh, that's Lewis. Yeah,
that's Lewis. Okay. Yeah.
So if you begin to throw over the board the idea of the objectivity of value, then what is it that guides your own moral choices? It will be something less than fully rational, Lewis argues. It will be, random association of ideas, your digestion, the weather, your genetic inheritance, or purely your own will, which has now been divorced from the anchor. It's been untethered from the root of what he calls the Tao, which is his term for this fund or reservoir of moral value, which is universal. And that's why he uses this term Tao, a Chinese word indicating that, people from in Eastern philosophies, Eastern religions have just as much access to this as Christians in the West, because this is something foundational to our humanity. This is the image of God in all people of goodwill. But if you turn out not to have a goodwill, if you've been badly brought up, if you've taken a lot of decisions which have steadily eroded your own conscience, then you're making yourself into something that's less than human, an artifact, something which is just, as it were, molded or kneaded or shaped or chopped up this way or that to suit your own convenience, or possibly to suit the convenience of someone else who has power over you. But the power will be not truly moral power. I mean, power is not a dirty word in itself. Power is, one of the attributes of God from a Christian point of view. We say it in the Lord's Prayer every day: for thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory. There's nothing wrong with power per se, as long as the power is exerted first over oneself. That this is a moral framework that we have to live within ourselves before we ever try to communicate it to anybody else. And if we don't live up to it ourselves, then our own teaching of it will be very ineffective. You were mentioning Hosea from the Old Testament. Just this morning, I came across that verse in the book of Proverbs about the, how does it go? It's Proverbs 18:17, about how the just man first accuses himself, or words to that effect.
Mhm.
And it's very important, I think, to keep this fact in mind, that the Lewis's argument is not just about terrible people out there. It's about us and how consistently we live in a moral fashion, and how ready we are to suffer for doing the right thing.
Yeah, I guess I think it's probably helpful to remember that he was this originally started as lectures where he's sitting there or standing there talking to his peers. And so his zingers are kind of hidden. They're like being dropped, but they're kind of under the surface to kind of like plan in, and maybe people will start thinking about it later. I think that might be helpful as someone reads it, to kind of put themselves in that situation where he's trying to seems to me like he's trying to draw some conviction out without being too confrontational. Does it seem like that to you, or?
Yes, he's certainly being very non-confrontational. This is why he takes all these interesting rhetorical moves to wrong foot anybody who assumes that, oh, here's C.S. Lewis, the Christian. He's just going to be teaching Christianity at me, and I know what Christianity says. And he's sidestepping all that very ingeniously by saying, well, first of all, I'm going to use a term from Confucian philosophy, this Chinese term, the Tao. You didn't expect that, did you? And secondly, I'm not even going to get as far as God, let alone the Christian God, in this argument. All I'm going to get as far as is a definition of humanity from a moral point of view. And the definition is objective value. Now, get out of that one, is basically his argument. So that sounded rather confrontational at the end, but it's not. It's all very rhetorically strategic. And he presumably didn't include the appendix in the lectures, but when he came to publish the lectures, he included this appendix of 8 moral laws. The law of general beneficence, the law of special beneficence, the law of duties to one's ancestors and elders, the duty to one's children and posterity, and so on and so forth. And under each heading, he cites any number of examples taken from Babylonian, Hindu, Jewish, Norse, Native American, Aboriginal Australian, and yes, Christian sources. But Christian sources are just, sprinkled in among the rest. They're not given special treatment because Lewis, he's being non-confrontational. He's saying this is what it means to be human. All human civilizations and cultures down through history have basically acknowledged the same central tenets of moral objective reality.
So Christy had a question, and she asked, have you talked to a moral relativist about this topic? Did abolition of man help at all?
Well, yes, I have in various contexts over the course of my life. And I think it is quite a powerful argument. I mean, you boil it down, don't you, to the sort of there is no absolute truth except the truth that there is no absolute truth. Oh, so there is an absolute truth.
Hmm.
And this is one of the things that Owen Barfield praised about the abolition of man. That he said, and not just the abolition of man, but Lewis's works more generally, that Lewis had this tendency of going around the back of someone and tripping them up from behind and saying, what you're saying about moral relativism, try applying that to the very statement you just made about the truth of moral relativism.
Uh-huh.
Is it absolutely true or only relatively true that moral relativism is true? And as soon as you start trying to apply it to your own statements and your own beliefs, then the absurdity of it is revealed. And so that I think is, in a way, the best way to apply the abolition of man to moral relativists and subjectivists in discussion. Just ask them to apply it to themselves and see where they go with that. It's not easy to get out of that one.
Yeah, that's the thing about truth. It will prove whichever direction you come at it from. And so if it falls, if it's not going to hold true in a particular way, then that can't be true. But anyway, if you just joined us on Facebook or YouTube, we are discussing After Humanity by Dr. Michael Ward, and this is a commentary and a guide on C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man. And this is available on Amazon, but you can also go to wordonfire.org, who's a publisher at /humanity, and order it there. Now, I have a question. I don't know if you would know this, but this comes in, it's pretty cool. It comes with a book. Sorry, I think it's going to knock out the background. And also a smaller, an edition, a corresponding edition to of The Abolition of Man. Is that only if you order it through Word on Fire, or does that also come if you get it on Amazon?
To be honest, I'm not sure. I think you don't get The Abolition of Man if you order through Amazon.
Okay.
You certainly do if you order it through the publisher.
Okay.
So I would advise people to go through the publisher.
Yeah, and so that's actually important because he gives page numbers for each of the references. So if it's not the one that comes with the Word on Fire, if it's not the one that Word on Fire publishes, then the page numbers are going to be different.
Well, not necessarily, because this new version of The Abolition of Man is the same edition that HarperCollins have been putting out for some years.
Oh,
it's just
a
different cover.
Okay.
So page numbers of several recent editions of The Abolition of Man will be the same as this version.
Oh, well, okay.
But
I didn't check mine, but
there are many editions of The Abolition of Man. So if you go back far enough, HarperCollins will eventually you'll reach an edition where the page numbers are different.
Okay, but you can still kind of check it by chapters. But anyway, okay. Well, the next thing we're going to talk about, and that I thought was really interesting, because Christy Lewis has a YouTube channel, and she has been reading a lot of things on Lewis, but this is on human participation. And she and I have talked a lot about form interaction with spirit, and that's kind of been my big theme for the past year. I read The Hunchback of Notre Dame and how he presents that concept. I completely missed that in the other times that I've read The Abolition of Man by C.S. Lewis, and that's a really big part of his whole essay, isn't it? Where let me see, what number was that? Page 38 on this, on your book. Okay, so this is on so now you're discussing the influence of C.S. Lewis and Michael Polanyi, is that what it was? But anyway, his insistence on the importance of personal knowledge in his book of that title, 1958, especially as it relates to scientific inquiry, bears the imprint of Lewis's ideas about participation. So let's see. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? About his idea of
Yeah. Well, participation is a very crucial term in Lewis's argument. He says that the Tao, this moral ecology, this moral framework, this moral atmosphere in which we find ourselves, is the thing in which to participate is to be truly human. And if you're not participating in it, therefore you're not truly human. You're beginning to become less than human in some way or other. You need to plug yourself in to this Tao, to this electrical current, if you like, which, as it varies, or these radio waves that you can tune into. It's something built into the structure of reality, and that we have access to as human beings. Participate in it, and you will find yourself flourishing as a human being. Disengage from it, and you'll begin to wither. So participation is a crucially important term for Lewis's whole argument, because he's not saying that right and wrong, good and evil are things so objective as to be, as it were, outside us, totally separate from us. No, they're so objective that they are inside us as well as outside us. And this is it's I in the course of my book, I sometimes use the term moral ecology or atmosphere, because that gets the idea of, or environment, that gets the idea of something which is both in us and outside us. It's like if you're breathing in dirty air, your lungs are going to be black. Breathe in clean air, and you'll be healthy. Breathe in a lot of moral rubbish, and your inside will quickly become morally corrupt. But equally, if you dwell internally, if you're continually mulling over and thinking evil thoughts, the world around you will become evil too. It's a two-way street. So subjectivism is a bad thing, but that isn't to say that we as subjects don't have moral responsibility or moral value. We do, and so making ourselves the right kinds of moral subjects is an important part of moral formation.
There was one part, I'm not sure if this is on the same page, where you said that the truth is subjective, but our perception of it is always going to be a little bit subjective. We ourselves are not totally objective.
The truth is objective, but we perceive it in a subjective manner. And that's because we are necessarily subjects, and we shouldn't be ashamed of that. We shouldn't try to pretend that we're not. And it's just because we have our own peculiar individual angle on reality does not mean that reality is subjectivist. It doesn't mean that there is nothing that we can gain access to, nothing secure out there that we can rely upon and conform ourselves to. It does mean, however, that we matter as individuals. This is maybe one of the reasons, when Lewis is talking in more obviously explicitly Christian terms, he implies that this is one of the reasons why we may have been made as individuals, so that our own unique perspective on reality can be incorporated into the grand symphony that God is conducting. So the idea that the Tao, this moral ecology, might somehow kind of flatten our significance as individuals, as moral subjects, is a groundless fear. We needn't worry about that. But that is a fear that some people have when you start talking to them about moral objectivity or moral absolutes. Then they think, oh, right, well, I'm just going to be steamrollered then, aren't I? And that's a legitimate fear, because moral authority is sometimes abused in a way which just eradicates people's individual value and their peculiar perspectives. But Lewis is careful not to go to that extreme. It's a tension. Things are not absolutely, utterly objective, in the sense that what you see and what I see will be precisely the same, but they are utterly objective in that what you see and I see, both our perspectives are about something which is genuinely outside us, that we did not create, and which we need to grapple with and come to terms with intelligently and knowledgeably. So it's neither eradicating our individual value, nor just the opposite, whatever the opposite is. I've sort of lost the train of my own thought here, but you see what I'm trying to get at.
Yeah, well, I think that in a way, when someone who is a subjectivist says that, okay, my truth is truth, basically they're putting themselves in the position of God, because they think they themselves have an objective view. If we don't realize that our view can be flawed, or that specifically very limited, that we're not seeing the whole thing, then that's what we're doing. We're putting ourselves in the place of God. And I think even sometimes as Christians, you know, we have to come to a place where we recognize that we're sinners in the need of a savior, that there is, you know, a God who is greater than us, who is absolute truth, justice, and righteousness, and that we need to conform to his image, not try to move him to suit us. But I think sometimes we forget that we are being transformed into his image, and we think that we're already done. And we stop listening, I think.
Yeah.
And, you know, David wrote a lot about that. Keep me from lying to myself. Because we can lie to ourselves if we're not willing to submit ourselves to the working of the Holy Spirit.
Yes, absolutely. We need one another. We need not just good laws on the statute book of our nation, but we need good examples in public life. We need good leaders in the church and in education and in society generally, in the culture at large, in the media, because we're constantly learning from one another and dependent upon one another for keeping the moral atmosphere clean, because we're breathing it in. But to go back to my earlier point, we need to keep ourselves clean. We need to watch our own language, as it were, and make sure that we are contributing nothing poisonous to this atmosphere. So it's not something that we can just, as it were, throw up our hands and say, "Oh, well, teach me." I'm completely, passive here. We are intelligent beings. We are rational creatures. And one of the images that Lewis uses in the course of his argument is that of the Aeolian lyre, the Aeolian harp. You know, the stringed instrument which you can put in the frame of a window, and as the wind blows through, it makes the strings sound. And Lewis talks about how the romantic poet Percy Shelley likens the human sensibility to an Aeolian harp, but with this important difference: the harp just has to respond to however the wind blows, but we as human beings, we have the power of internal adjustment. We can, as it were, tighten our strings or loosen our strings, and so change the note that is sounded as the wind blows through us. Because we have moral responsibility too. We're not just, blocks of clay that take an imprint from an outside moral authority. We generate something of that moral feature ourselves from our own internal choices. So it's, as I say, it's something that's in tension. The internal and the external, the subjective and the objective are in a dynamic tension here.
So that's you have a whole section on that too about how that it's not to be taught, but it has to be almost it's rather to be apprenticed. You have to follow people's examples in living rightly. And I think that ties in with it is confirmed by the research that I'm trying to remember. I think it might have been Barna Group that did this study, but they found that the biggest indicator of whether someone would stay in the faith from childhood to adult if was the example of their parents' faith. So if someone their parents were Christians and they were just basically kind of like Sunday Christians that didn't really, they didn't live it, then the odds were that they would reject their faith as an adult.
Yes, absolutely. And I think further research has shown, to put a fine point on what you just said, it's not just the parents' example, but in particular, the father's example. Now, there are reasons for that we needn't get into, but that's an interesting point. And those fathers who are watching, take note of that.
Yeah.
But yeah, of course, because our parents have this incredible effect upon our formation. We're pretty much under their authority for at least, I don't know, the first 12 years of our life, and until we hit puberty and begin to stride out and make our own mistakes. And those of us who have been blessed with very loving, caring parents, whose example doesn't need to be reacted against terribly. I was fortunate myself with my parents. They walked the talk. They taught me Christian values and exemplified them, so I could see that they were possible to live out. My parents were very consistent examples. So I was hugely fortunate in that respect. But if you're not raised by moral parents or guardians or whoever it may be who's responsible for your upbringing, you have a difficulty which will have to be wrestled with. It's not insurmountable by any means, and many great heroes come from very difficult backgrounds. But all things being equal, of course, you want your parents to be great moral exemplars.
I think that just reading some of the books I've been reading in this past year, it's really illustrated. Obviously, it's best if your parents are the example. And I think this should be a word of warning or just a point of like a self-examination. What am I transmitting to my kids? Am I helping them grow closer to God, or are my actions putting up a barrier to Him? But apart from that, like Charlotte Thomason's story, I mean, she just came out with a memoir, What Kind of Love Is This? She was a fellow graduate of the apologetics program. She had a horrible family. You could not find probably a family more horrible than that. And even in the church, there was some more, came into contact with more predators. But it only takes a few people to make a difference. Just one or two that can show you like what the love of Christ is. It only takes a few to make a life-changing difference.
Absolutely. To be salt and light, you don't need a lot of salt in the meal to make it tasty. In fact, you can almost oversalt things if you're not careful.
Yeah.
You can in other words, you can become moralistic. You can become puritanical. You can be over scrupulous, and that's a very bad moral error too. And you don't need much light in a room in order to see your way around. So you don't absolutely need, by any means, that's what I was just saying, you don't have to have been brought up by morally perfect parents to know good from evil and right from wrong. and it shows us that, it's an encouraging thought that, one helpful word in the ear of some suffering child can really be life-changing.
The other thing too is that, I mean, this isn't specifically about the Abolition Man, but just about C.S. Lewis in general, is how important influences are. And I think his story is one that, if you have friends that aren't believers, is that you don't give up on them, because he was worked on for how many years before he finally came to Christ. It was a long, long road. And then look where he ended up.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, Lewis had a good upbringing. He was raised by loving parents in a Christian home. He turned away from his faith in his teens and spent much of his teens and 20s wandering. But yeah, he came back to Christianity in his early 30s. And having had that very dramatic adult conversion, the second half of his life was radically altered. Lewis has been described by Walter Hooper, his secretary and editor, as the most converted man he ever met. And I think you can see the truth of that in Lewis's own life, that adult conversion when he was about 31 really is the hinge about which his whole life turned. And you can see him becoming a more integrated, more humble, more loving person. If you look just at the letters that he wrote in the 3 years before and the 3 years after his Christian conversion, you can just see him becoming a different kind of person. And it's very, it's a profound testimony, because Lewis is testifying to his own change of heart without even realizing it, just through the letters that he's writing. These letters are not necessarily about his conversion, but the fact of his conversion is manifest in the way that he is behaving. And that brings us back, if we can go back to the point about participation, that that Lewis's attitude to morality was very relaxed in one sense. He says that those who think that morality is the end of life haven't even begun to realize what life is really about. Morality is just like grammar. But who thinks that the most important thing about a sentence is its grammatical structure? The important thing about a sentence is the truth and the goodness and the beauty that comes through the sentence, the poetry of the sentence. Grammar, or morality, he says, is like choreography. If you're learning to dance, you need to have the steps laid out this way and that. But then once you're dancing, the choreography, as it were, vanishes, and the dance itself comes to life. Likewise, morality vanishes when you're leading a moral life. You can forget about it, because you're so in the sweet spot, you're in the zone, as it were, that all those sort of scrupulous, conscientious, ethical worries that you might have had, they just disappear, and you learn to live a good, true, and beautiful life. And that's true participation.
So it's more like it's a means to an end, of getting to the end rather than the end itself. Christy Lewis, who's been making some comments on the stream, she wrote an article for us in the last issue of An Unexpected Journal. It was Saved by Grace. Is a testimony of her parents, actually, who were in a cult in their 20s. And one of the things that they said was that, it was very, the cult was very legalistic. They were focusing a lot on behavior. And when the comment that they made, they said, when you're a legalist is self-focused. And that's not the point. The moral law is to help us come into relationship and communion with other people and with God. It's not the end. It's just a means to the end.
Yeah. It's like mountaineering. This is another image that Lewis uses, that you need your ropes and your axes and your crampons or whatever they're called, and your in your weatherproof jacket and your gloves to climb to the top of the mountain of morality. But when you get to the top, you don't just stop there and preen and plume yourself on having achieved a moral status. No, the rest, he says, is a matter of flying. You you reach the top of the mountain in order to launch yourself forward into a whole other element. I'm quoting here his essay, Man or Rabbit, ? Man or rabbit? Are we truly human, or are we just, worried, conscientious rabbits, combing ourselves and quivering in fear because we think we might put a moral foot wrong somewhere? That's not moral life. That's not true Christian moral life. He says that the road to the promised land leads past Mount Sinai. The road to the promised land leads past Mount Sinai. You have to go to Mount Sinai and get the 10 Commandments, get the law, but you don't stop there. You go on into the promised land, the land flowing with milk and honey, the land of innocence and sweetness. And that's the land of freedom and festivity. That's the moral life, properly lived out.
So we are almost at the end of our time, and let me put up the ordering information. You can go to, sorry, my mouse went off here. You can go to wordonfire.org/humanity to order it directly from the publisher. And with that, you will get a copy of Dr. Ward's book, After Humanity, as well as the companion edition of Abolition of Man. And also in the back of the book, I think this is After Humanity and Abolition of Man is a good book to go through with a group of people. So you have someone to discuss it with, so you're not like stuck in your head. But you also have in the back a whole list of discussion questions. So I think that would be helpful if you're going through it with a book club. I'm going to make a playlist of some of the interviews that Dr. Ward has done, so you can, kind of get some more insight. But if you haven't read The Abolition of Man, I highly recommend that you get it and just dive into it. And reading After Humanity will really help explicate it. So do you have any advice for people that are maybe wanting to tackle The Abolition of Man?
Yes, and that is one very good way of limbering up for The Abolition of Man is to read the first 4 chapters of Mere Christianity.
Oh, yeah.
If you read the first 4 chapters of Mere Christianity, you're getting a kind of more popular version of the argument of The Abolition of Man, because Mere Christianity originated not as high-level university lectures, but as 15-minute broadcasts over the BBC, when Lewis couldn't rely upon his audience having any particular level of education. So he makes everything very accessible, very approachable. So read those first 4 chapters of Mere Christianity, right or wrong as a clue to the meaning of the universe. And that will be a very good way of, softening the ground and warming yourself up for The Abolition of Man.
So if let's just say someone was doing a book club, or they wanted to have something at their church. I know my church sometimes will have kind of read-throughs of things. Would you recommend those first 4 chapters and then The Abolition of Man with your book?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Read those first 4 chapters, then read The Abolition of Man, then read After Humanity with The Abolition of Man.
Okay, yeah. Okay, so that could take up, actually, you could probably do a whole 9-month, from fall to summer. So if you're in charge of programming at your church, you're welcome. You can, we've just given you a help for your classes. So anyway, well, thank you everyone for joining us. And if you found this useful, be sure to share this video with a friend. Also, you can go to Dr. Ward's website, michaelward.net, to learn more about him, see his other books that he's done, and also follow the work that he's doing. And so anyway, thanks for watching, and we will see you next time.